Welcome back to the last lecture of this section. And so in this one, we're going to apply everything that we learned in the last few videos to coding challenge number 3. And this coding challenge basically has two parts. So in the first part, I want you to write an async function called load and pause, which will basically recreate coding challenge number 2, but this time using async await. And so, of course, that is only about the part where we actually consume the promise. Then you can compare the two versions that you have and think about the big differences and also see which one you like more. Now, in order to do this, don't forget to set your network tab to fast 3G. All right. So that's part number 1, basically converting what we did before. But then comes part number 2, which is again a more difficult one. And actually in this one, you will do something that we didn't do before, but I'm sure that with the instructions here, you can make it. So what I want you to do is to create an async function load all, and this one receives an array of image path, and so that's this one. So it's an array which contains the path of all 3 images in the image folder. Okay, so you receive that array in the function, and then I want you to use the map method to loop over the array in order to load all the images that are here in this array with the create image function. So this one here where we promisified loading an image. Okay. Of course, the map method will then result in a new array, and you should call this one images like this. Now keep in mind that create image here will return a promise. And so the callback function of the map method needs to be special. So you need to consume the promise that comes from create image. And so therefore, as I said, the callback function in the map method should be a special type of function. So I'm not spoiling which function it is, but hopefully you can guess what I'm talking about. All right. But anyway, next, I want you to check out this images array in the console. And is it what you expected? So again, here I want you to think about the result that you get. So this images array, and think if you expected it to be like this, and also if it makes sense. Okay, and what I just said will make sense once you get there. Then, in the next step, you should use a promise combinator function to actually get the images from the array. So this is a very important hint right there. Then finally, you should also add the parallel class to all the images. And so once again, you should probably loop over the images and then to each of them add this class. So again, this part 2 here actually contains some new parts that you will have to figure out on your own and experiment a little bit with that. But at this point of the course, so already pretty deep into it, it's probably a good idea that you start experimenting with some stuff on your own. And so that's why I created this challenge like this. So good luck with this, take all the time that you need, and then I see you back here. Welcome back here to my solution now. So as you see, I already have all the code here from challenge 2. And so what we're going to change now is basically this part here. So we will recreate this big then chain using now async await. So the function is called load and pause. And it is an async function which doesn't have any arguments. I'm missing the function keyword. So it doesn't have any arguments. And so as always, we need to wrap everything into a try block. And then here the error. And actually right now it is already allowed to use catch without the error. So that's new in JavaScript. Previously that wasn't allowed. But just to make it consistent, I always use the error here, even if I then don't need it. But here let's just log it to the console as always. All right. So here is the first promise. So this one. So let's put that here. And since we're using async await, I will now await that promise and store the result into image. So that's basically the variable that we have here as the parameter in the then method. And so that's the same name that makes sense here. So image, and let's use 1 here because we're going to have multiple. Or actually, that's not even necessary because this time we won't need the current image variable. Okay, but more about that once we reach that point. So again, the image is of course the result of this successful promise. All right, and so with that, we already translated this here. Now what we need is to simply log this to the console. And so here we have load image 1 already. Then next up, we have this wait. And so here we can just await for wait 2. And just like before, since the wait promise does not have any resolved value, we actually don't need to save anything to any variable. So here we basically just pause the execution for 2 seconds, and then what we want to do is this. But not exactly this, because now instead of current image, we can use simply image. And that's because now we are still here in the same function, or actually in the same block, and so in the same scope. While here, we defined the image in one function, and then we set the style in another function. And so then we needed to use this global variable. So like this, it is a lot better, of course. And so now we just need to do the same for image 2. So again, we don't need the external variable. We can now simply reassign image. So image 2, then image 2 loaded. And the rest works simply exactly the same. Here, let's just change to error. And with that, we should already be good to go. So load and pause. And here, let me comment this out so that the same logic doesn't happen twice. And so this is already part 1. Let's set our network here to slow, or actually fast 3G. And let's actually inspect the images arriving here. So I think that this part here is really helpful. So seeing everything arrive, it's just a bit difficult. But anyway, let's just try it. And so here you see the image loading. And so then here was the waiting time of 2 seconds, and then the next image loaded and finished. So again, image 1 loaded during all this time. Then we had our 2-second waiting time right here. And then during this time, the second image loaded. And here we can actually get all this detail about that. So this is really interesting stuff if you want to dig deep into this. All right, but anyway, that's part 1. And so now let's go to part 2 to create this async function called load all, which receives image array. And then we loop over the array and create an array images. So just keeping these names in mind. So part 2 will be load all is an async function which takes in img r. Then as always, this block, so try catch. And now here we have to create that images array, which is the result of image r dot map. But now we need to think about the callback function here, right? So in each iteration of the array, we have one image, and we want to use the create image function to load that image. Now, this function here returns a promise, right? And so we should await that promise. Otherwise, nothing is going to happen. And so here we need to make this function an async function so that then in there we can use await. All right. So let's actually pause this one here just as instructed. And instead we will call load all with this test array. All right. And then the instruction was also to check out this images array. So images. Okay. And so now let's take a look at the console. Let's make it a bit bigger again here. And so what we got here are actually 3 promises. So we have an array of promises and not the images themselves. And this is actually a big source of confusion for most async await beginners. And I actually remember really well when I first stumbled upon this problem and didn't really understand why this was happening. However, with all the knowledge that you just learned in this section, if we really think about this, then it might actually make sense. So here we have an async function, right? And this is an arrow function. So we have an implicit return. So this is like returning something from this callback function in each iteration, right? However, as we already know, an async function will always return a promise and not really the value that we're interested in, right? Instead, the value that we want to return is going to be the fulfilled value of the promise that the async function returns. Remember that? And so that is exactly what is happening here, but it is happening simply 3 times. So we are returning something 3 times from an async function here, and so therefore the result will be 3 promises. Okay? So just like it happened in that lecture where we attempted to return a string from one of the functions. Remember that? So here it is indeed the exact same situation. So again, we end up with this array of promises. Okay? But of course, behind the scenes, the images are already being loaded, and so we're basically fine. So all we need to do now is to get these image elements themselves out of the promise. So how can we do that? Well, we could take each promise out of the array and then manually await it, but that wouldn't make much sense. First, because we would have additional work, and second, because then that work would not be happening in parallel, right? But we want it to be happening in parallel, and therefore we can use promise.all. So promise.all is perfect for this because it already expects an array of images. And so this images array is already perfect to handle by this function, right? And so now we simply need to store the image elements here. So let's call it that into this array. So let's then take a look at that. And so now this is, of course, going to take some time. So this can only happen once the images are actually loaded. And so now, indeed, here we go. All right. So here are the 3 image elements, and they're now hidden. And so that's why we need to add the parallel class later. So again, this worked because here in this loop, of course, the await keyword did its job of pausing the execution of the function, right? And so therefore, only after that, we did then promise.all to actually get the image elements out of the promises array. So this was a bit tricky, but maybe you did figure out that this is how you solve this problem. So once you need to use async await in a map method like this, which, believe me, is pretty common, then you end up with an array of promises that you can then, as a next step, handle like this. So with the promise.all combinator function. And so now the next step is actually pretty easy. All we have to do is to loop over this array and add the parallel class to it. So image element. And so now we don't want a new array. We simply want to do something on each of the elements. And so image.classList.add parallel like this. And let's get rid of this console.log here. And in our network tab, oh, this is pretty big. So you see the images are all loading there now, right? And here we go. So now we have the images nicely displayed and set side by side. Let's make it a bit smaller so we can actually see something. And indeed, there we go. Let's just see it one more time. Also here, the resources actually loading. To see it, we need to make it even smaller. And so you see that down here, the three images basically started loading all at the same time, which is because of this loop here, which will of course execute these three callback functions all one after another. Okay. All right. And with this, we are actually finished with this challenge and also with this whole section. So make sure that you understood what we did here in this part 2, because this is pretty important. But besides that, your job is now done for this section. So really happy to still see you here and still learning JavaScript and still making progress. So well done. You can be really proud of yourself. And I really mean that. And now I see you back here next time in the next section.